Just to follow what President Trump is saying here at his cabinet meeting.
So we've got Chairman Powell in the House of Representatives. Meanwhile, new developments coming out of the White House. President Trump saying that the auto industry is going to be the focus of a meeting with the European Union Commissioner Juncker next week when he visits the White House on the 25th. This comes following what the EU has done this week, Sherry, with regards to Japan inking the largest type of trade deal that we've seen. And quite frankly, coming at a time in which the European Union is looking to respond directly to the protectionist strategies of the Trump administration's trade policies. So a lot of moving parts on this. We should note that the EU has said that they would be willing to potentially look into the auto tariffs, but France doesn't like that at all.
Sure. And of course, we also have the ongoing trade negotiations or renegotiations on NAFTA with Canada and Mexico. We're now hearing that they're getting closer in trade negotiations with Mexico. And of course, this coming as Mexico just had a presidential election and had a leftist government coming into place in December. What are we hearing from the administration on where these negotiations are going?
Well, two things. First and foremost, they have said that they want to, the Mexicans and the U.S. have said that they want to get this done more quickly than perhaps I previously thought, with the fall being the potential time period for when something would get negotiated. But the second point that I would make is that, as you mentioned, this is a much more progressive government. The president has said consistently that he would prefer to have one-offs with both Mexico and with Canada. But I would also note that should the president decide to pull out of NAFTA, they would be falling back on deals and legislation and the crux of how they would be able to go about negotiating those deals that would need congressional approval, some type of congressional approval. And that's where things get interesting, because we've seen that the appetite on Capitol Hill has been, even amongst Republicans, to rein in the president's ability to do some of those trade negotiations. Whether or not anything gets passed, we're not yet there yet.
It's very interesting to see President Trump just withdraw from these multilateral agreements. He really wants those bilateral deals to take place. President Trump again saying he may do a separate trade deal with Mexico. Of course, he also wants a separate trade deal, not only with Mexico, with Canada, as you mentioned, but also with Japan. But you told us yesterday that Japan is having something else going on with the European Union. So this all coming into play at a time when President Trump is just pushing a different agenda for the United States.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this trade deal with the EU and Japan represents 2/3 of the world's GDP. And so the president has said consistently that he prefers to do these types of bilateral trade agreements, but he's getting a multilateral response. In addition to that, the EU just having gathered in China for an annual conference of sorts in which they are talking about the issue of trade. And it also comes at a time in which, quite frankly, the Chinese are looking for how to respond to this as well. But there's been widespread growing consensus that perhaps the Chinese growth model might be a bit on the back foot as a result of what we're seeing coming out of Washington. But, that meeting next week with the EU and President Trump coming after he literally just said that NATO was, quote unquote, a foe in terms of trade and on economics.